This is our first video looking at various explanations for obedience. We're going to be looking at situational variables, we're going to be looking at psychological factors, and also dispositional explanations. So today, looking at situational variables, which includes location, proximity, and uniform. So these were the situational variables that were investigated by Milgram. The first one is proximity. So when we're talking about proximity, we're talking about the physical closeness or the distance between the authority figure and the person that they're giving an order to. So in the case of Milgram's experiment, it would be the distance between the experimenter, who was giving the prods, and the teacher, who was our genuine participant. So it could refer to the distance between the authority figure and the person they're giving orders to, or it could be the physical closeness of the teacher to the victim. So in this case, the teacher, which is our real genuine participant, and the learner, the confederate of Milgram. So proximity could refer to either of these, but really it's just talking about the physical closeness. How close together are they? Are they in the same room? Are they in different rooms? So let's have a look at the different variations that Milgram conducted to investigate this variable. In his original, you'll remember that the teacher and the learner were in adjacent rooms. And so here we had our learner who was hooked up to the shock generator, and our teacher in here sitting at a desk with the shock generator supposedly inflicting pain on the learner. So they're in a different room. But what happens when we alter this? What happens when we put the teacher and the learner in the same room? In this case, not surprisingly, obedience rates declined from 65% of people going up to the maximum 450 volts in the original, down to 40% when they're in the same room. So here, as proximity increases, as they get closer, then obedience decreases. In another variation, the proximity increases even further. This time, not only are teacher and learner in the same room, but it's the teacher who has to force the participant's hand on a shock plate. So here, rather than the teacher being in a different room to the learner, as we saw in the original, the teacher and learner are in the same room, and the teacher is placing the learner's hand on the shock plate. And so they're even closer to the person that they're inflicting pain on. And here again, not surprisingly, we see obedience rates drop even further, from 65% in the original to 30% here. And in yet another variation, here we're talking about the proximity between the authority figure and the person who they are giving orders to. In the original research, we had the experimenter also in the room here with the teacher, and they were giving verbal prods. You must go on, for example. But in this variation, the experimenter was not in the room with the learner. This time, the experimenter was giving those orders, those verbal prods, to the teacher via the telephone. And when we decrease the proximity, i.e. we're increasing the distance, then obedience decreases. So why does this happen? Why does proximity have such a significant effect on obedience rates? Well, when we decrease the proximity, in this case between the teacher, the real participant, and the learner, the confederate. So when we decrease the proximity, i.e. they're further away, it allows people to psychologically distance themselves from the consequences of their actions. Another way to think about this is the difference between shooting somebody at point blank range and being able to drop a bomb from a control center across the other side of the world. It is much easier when you've been able to psychologically distance yourself from the consequences of your actions, when the learner's suffering is less obvious. In this situation, the teacher becomes less aware of the harm that they're causing to another person. They're too far removed from it. And so they're less aware of how much suffering they are inflicting on another person. And therefore, this increases obedience rates. And the opposite is true when we increase proximity. So as the teacher and learner are closer together in the same room, for example, then the teacher is now confronted with the harm that they're causing to somebody else. And so in this instance, obedience rates decrease. Likewise, when we're talking about the proximity between our authority figure and the person that they're giving orders to, the greater distance or the less proximity there is between authority figure and person, then that's going to have an influence on obedience as well. The greater the distance, then the lower the rates of obedience. You're not going to obey somebody if they give you the order of the telephone, but if they're standing right next to you barking orders at you, then you're much more likely to follow them. So the next variable that Milgram investigated was location. So this refers to the place where the issue from the authority figure is ordered. And this is relevant because it relates to the status or the prestige associated with the location. And this links to one of our later explanations, which is legitimacy of authority. So you'll remember in Milgram's original experiment, it was conducted at Yale University, a very prestigious university with a strong reputation. When Milgram conducted the same research, the exact same experiment, but this time in a rundown office block, then obedience rates decreased from 65% in the original to 48%. So as we know, locations that add perceived legitimacy, like Yale University, increase obedience rates. As we move to a less legitimate location, then obedience rates are going to decrease. Why? Well, it seemed like the prestigious environment of Yale University gave Milgram's study legitimacy and authority. It increased the apparent credibility and expertise of the experimenter. We believed him, we believed that his orders were worthwhile, and we believed that we needed to obey them. So participants were more obedient because they believed that the experimenter shared the legitimacy of Yale University, and therefore obedience was expected. However, remember that obedience rates were still actually quite high even when it was conducted in the rundown office building. 48% of participants still administered shocks up to 450 volts. So why? Perhaps it's possible that the participants perceived the scientific nature of the experiment to be legitimate. Regardless of the location, people see science as being legitimate, and so therefore that could have led to still quite high rates of obedience. The final variable is uniform. Now, just a note that this wasn't actually studied by Milgram himself. Others have done variations of Milgram's experiment to test this variable. So, what we believe is that individuals in positions of authority often have some sort of specific outfit that is really symbolic of their authority, and it indicates that they are entitled to expect our obedience. Think police officers, think judges, think army officers. What they wear tells us that they're important and that they ought to be obeyed. So in Milgram's study, the experimenter who was giving the verbal prods was wearing a grey lab coat, and this added legitimacy to the authority figure. Suddenly, this is somebody who, through their uniform, is seen as somebody who should be obeyed. So this experiment was conducted by Bickman, who did a different study on obedience rates. It wasn't an exact replication of Milgram's research, but it was still investigating the influence of uniform on obedience to authority. So in Bickman's study, they had the same man who was dressed as either a security guard, a milkman, or a pedestrian stand on the streets of New York City and instruct participants to do things. He was giving them orders like an authority figure would. Some of the orders were to pick up some trash that was on the sidewalk. Another order was to put a dime in the parking meter because somebody's thing was about to expire. So they were given sort of mundane orders that they needed to follow, which is problematic, but we'll come to that later. So they're given mundane orders that they needed to follow, and Bickman observed who they were obeying. And it was interesting because the security guard, who was wearing a uniform that looked like a police officer's, led to high rates of obedience. 76% of passers-by obeyed the security guard's orders. For the milkman, 47%. Interesting that he's still in a uniform, but this time that uniform seems to be less legitimate than the uniform of the security guard. And when he was just wearing a sports coat, just normal sort of pedestrian casual clothes, only 30% of people obeyed the man's orders. And so here, the same man giving the same orders, we can see how much of an effect uniform has on rates of obedience. So, why? Uniforms encourage obedience because they're widely recognised as symbols of authority. The lab coat and Milgram study tells us that this person possesses scientific expertise, that they are an expert and that they should really be seen as a credible figure. They know what they're talking about and therefore we should follow their orders. We expect that somebody in a uniform is entitled to our obedience because of the legitimacy of their authority. Their authority is granted by society. We grant authority to police officers. We grant authority to army soldiers, commanders, because they're the people in charge. We expect to be obeying them because they're in a position where they need to make decisions and we need to obey them. Police officers need to enforce the law and therefore society needs to obey the orders of a police officer. So someone with a uniform should expect our obedience and somebody without a uniform has less right to expect our obedience. Just one thing to note with Bickman's research. The tasks and the instructions were even more trivial. Than Milgram's. Just think, Milgram was asking participants to inflict harm upon another person. Bickman was just asking people to pick up some rubbish or put a dime in the parking meter. And so there's fewer consequences for disobeying, and this might have been an explanation for those increased obedience rates. Just something to keep in mind. So, what is going to be really important is for you to study this table and for you to know all of these percentages. So perhaps create some cue cards with the variation on one side and the percentage on the other and make sure that you commit this to memory.